Right now, Russia's army is suffering a complete collapse. A staggering 20,538 Russian soldiers have gone AWOL, showcasing just how little Putin's soldiers actually care for his cause. This is unprecedented. It was never as bad as it is now for Russia, and Putin is furious. The news came from the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD, which posted an intelligence update on June 30th, detailing just how many Russian soldiers have been caught deserting their posts. Sharing data from Russian news outlet Mediazona, the MOD shared that 20,538 soldiers have found themselves standing in front of a Russian court on charges of desertion, refusing orders, or going absent without leave, or AWOL, since Putin's invasion began in February 2022. The latter is the biggest of the three offenses. The MOD says that Russia's courts have heard 18,159 cases of soldiers going AWOL, which is 88.4% of the total, and most of these soldiers get convicted. Under Section 337 of Russia's criminal code, going AWOL now carries a 10-year prison sentence. Of those tried, 17,721 have been prosecuted, amounting to 86.2% of those facing charges. This is huge. Russia's official narrative tells us that the Kremlin values the military service of those who fight in Ukraine. Putin uses pay to demonstrate that appreciation of value. BBC Monitoring says that Russia relies heavily on the financial incentives it offers to new soldiers, with advance payments made to contract soldiers having risen by 450% since the Ukraine invasion began, and soldiers now earn up to 600% more than Russia's average annual wage. All of the money is a smokescreen, a sign of desperation on Russia's behalf. The reality is that Putin has to pay that much because people wouldn't fight for him otherwise. Russia doesn't value the service its soldiers provide. It never did. If it did, Putin wouldn't be in a situation where his military has suffered over 1 million casualties in the war so far. Brutality reigns in Russia's military, with those who are lured in by the promise of a small fortune being sent to serve as meat shields in massive human wave assaults against Ukraine. Tactics go out of the window. Once you're in the Russian army, you're supposed to sacrifice yourself for Putin's cause, whether you want to or not. Over 20,000 soldiers have said no, and Russia is punishing them for it. We mentioned that Russia has passed laws allowing it to hand down prison sentences of up to 10 years for those it finds guilty of going AWOL from its military. These laws don't represent an idle threat. Putin is following through on them by handing out the full sentence whenever he can. For instance, November 2024 saw Medusa report that a 37-year-old soldier named Yevgeny Sandulsky had received the full 10 years for charges of desertion. It was the harshest known punishment meted out to a soldier to date, the outlet said, surpassing the 9-year sentence given to a draftee named Vladislav Urulin, who Russia found guilty of deserting his post 3 times and assaulting another member of the military. Originally, Sandulsky was charged with 4 counts of unauthorized absence or going AWOL from his unit during an 18-month holiday, Medusa says. However, Putin's cronies weren't happy with that. They upgraded his charge to full-blown desertion, which carries an even harsher maximum penalty than going AWOL, 15 years. Sandulsky didn't get the full 15 years, but his 10-year sentence showcases just how brutal the consequences can be for somebody who chooses not to fight in Putin's terrible war. Even worse for Putin is that many of his soldiers are now happy to accept the consequences of deserting or going AWOL. That's according to World Crunch, which wrote on June 25th that some 49,000 soldiers have deserted from the Russian army since the start of Putin's war. Add to that the 20,000 who have gone AWOL, and you get almost 70,000 troops who've just decided to stop fighting for a cause in which they clearly don't believe. The outlet tells the tale of a man it gives the pseudonym of Vladimir. Facing charges of desertion, Vladimir received a guilty verdict. The soldier's lawyer leaned over to him and simply said, "Better this than lying under a bush in Ukraine." Vladimir's wife, dubbed Elena by World Crunch, also said she'd rather her husband be in prison than on the front lines. "It felt like a weight had been lifted. Our youngest child is only 1 year old, and now at least he'll be growing up knowing his father, and I know that he's in prison. The doors will open one day, and he'll walk out a free man," she said. Vladimir was so ready to desert for a simple reason. He believed that the only other way out of the Ukraine war was in a body bag, and that's almost what happened. After being mobilized and serving for 2 years, Vladimir received a leg wound that forced the Russian army to send him home on medical leave. It was then that he made his decision. Better prison than going back to Ukraine. Vladimir never willingly returned to Russia's military, but he was almost forced. He was detained on the street before his leg had fully healed and packed into a train filled with contract soldiers heading to St. Petersburg, World Crunch says. He was heading back to the front lines. Vladimir opted out. Once he arrived in St. Petersburg, he escaped and laid low at a friend's house, waiting for his lawyer to open a case for him going AWOL. Better prison than going back to the front lines. For Vladimir, 2 years of fighting and the prospect of heading back home in a body bag right when his wife had given birth to a new child was enough for him to make his choice. For others who go AWOL, the MOD says there are several other potential reasons for their decisions. One of those reasons is the brutal discipline soldiers face once they join Russia's army. That's been a problem that Putin has been trying to solve, or at least acting like he's trying to solve, for many years. In February 2020, the Moscow Times reported that Putin's then decade-long attempts to reform the Russian military had been fruitless when it came to discipline. It told the story of a soldier named Artyom Putin. He was subjected to intense hazing when he joined Russia's military, once sending a message to his mother that read, "Mum, don't believe what anyone tells you. They're bullying me here, exhausting me psychologically and extorting money. I don't see how I can go on. I'm already very tired. I'm sorry it all turned out like this." If that sounds like a suicide note to you, you're right. The Moscow Times says that Putin's hazing included the carving of a word for male genitals on his forehead with a razor for the crime of smoking a cigarette in his barracks toilets. That was Putin's final straw. In April 2018, he used his AK-74 to shoot himself dead during a training session. Putin's situation is far from unique. The Moscow Times tells the stories of other soldiers who've been subjected to rampant bullying and even threats of rape during their training. Beatings and humiliations were common in 2020, showing us two things: Putin's reforms had failed, and Russia's leader didn't seem to care. Fast forward to December 2023, over a year and a half into the Ukraine invasion, and the situation wasn't much better. In that month, Foreign Policy reported that the Russian military's brutality still began with intense hazing during a recruit's training. It gave a name to the brutal discipline a recruit faces in Russia's army: desertion. It's a philosophy that began during the Soviet era, and it's ingrained into Russia's modern military culture. Foreign Policy calls it a formative part of Russia's military identity, with the purpose of the brutality inflicted during training being to instill in the country's soldiers the level of violence they'll need to inflict pain on others when they're fighting. It's desensitization on a massive scale. Putin, driven to the brink by relentless abuse, ultimately turned his rifle on himself in a final act of desperation. More than 20,000 other Russian soldiers handle it by going AWOL. And desertion doesn't end once a recruit ends up on the front lines. In May, the Express reported that Russian soldiers who refused to head out to the front lines are being forced to fight against each other in gladiatorial fights to the death, with the winner getting the promise of a release from their contract. It reports that evidence of this practice comes from the Donbass, where one soldier is reported to have choked another, a former ally, to death in a desperate effort to win his freedom from military service. What we have here is a pattern. A Russian military that is built on brutal discipline, designed to break down its soldiers and turn them into shells of humans, is willing to inflict barbaric torture on their enemies because they faced that same barbarism themselves. Putin may pay lip service to undergoing reforms. He may tell his soldiers that he values their lives. But the reality is that he and his cronies are doing nothing to stop these outdated hazing rituals. If you join Russia's army, the first threat you face comes from your peers. The MOD says that's often more than enough for troops to go AWOL. Brutality isn't the only reason that soldiers go AWOL, just as the prospect of going home in a body bag isn't the only reason. The MOD also cites poor medical treatment as one of the key reasons why Russian troops are abandoning their posts en masse. We get a hint of this from Vladimir's story. Though he was sent on medical leave for a leg wound, that wound wasn't fully healed before Russia attempted to send him back out to fight. His story isn't uncommon. Back in November, UK's MOD published a report to X showcasing the lack of care being provided to Russia's wounded. It quoted the Astra news agency to highlight an incident in Novosibirsk, which is in central Russia. There, soldiers from Russia's 41st Combined Arms Army staged a riot after complaining of mistreatment and Russia's attempts to send them back to the front lines before they were fully healed. The rioters smashed windows and damaged their barracks, with 10 fleeing the compound rather than allowing themselves to be sent back to the front line before they'd healed. On June 27th, the Centre for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, posted an article examining Russia's military casualties broaching the 1 million mark. "Fight or die. Grim options for Russia's wounded," blared the article's headline, with the piece explaining that Russia reached its bloody milestone in part because of the poor medical treatment it provides to its soldiers. "Not all of the wounded receive medical assistance. The quality of care is low, and hospitals are focused on returning soldiers to the front, whether they are fully recovered or not," CEPA said. It also quoted a Russian doctor interviewed by the Transformer Telegram channel, who said that Russian soldiers aren't trained in basic first aid, meaning that many of the country's troops die on the field because there's nobody around them who could administer any sort of treatment. Right now, the doctor says, Russia's military wounded don't have access to enough beds, medicines, doctors, or even sheets for their recovery. Think about how all of that must play on the mind of a soldier injured in Ukraine. On one hand, they're bombarded with messages from Putin's cronies about how much their military cares for them. The pay certainly seems to indicate that's true, but when it comes down to brass tacks and a soldier sustains an injury, they're either left to die on the battlefield or get sent to medical treatment facilities that aren't equipped to deal with their injuries. Is it any wonder that over 20,000 soldiers have gone AWOL? Fight or die. Those are the two choices presented to Russia's soldiers, with many choosing to take a third option of abandoning their duties regardless of the prison sentences that await them. We mentioned that Russia's soldiers aren't being trained in basic first aid. The MOD says that a lack of training in general is yet another reason why so many of the country's troops choose to go AWOL. A contract soldier could arrive at the front lines from within 14 days of signing a contract and receive only 5 days of relevant military training, the MOD says. Most of Russia's soldiers aren't ready for what awaits them in Ukraine. And that seems to be by design, as Putin desperately tries to get more bodies onto the battlefield. News of Russia's training problems is hardly new. In September 2024, Business Insider reported on comments made by George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War. He told the outlet, "I find myself being surprised with the new depths of how poor the Russian individual soldier quality is," he told the outlet. He adds that each new batch of recruits seems to be getting progressively worse than those who came before, stating, "It's becoming really difficult for me to see what other additional shortcuts they could take, other than maybe deploying just people unfit for service. The bar for entry into Russia's military is very, very low at this point," Barros concludes, and it's this lack of training that is responsible for a huge number of the casualties Russia is experiencing in Ukraine. We see an example of the results of this lack of training in Russia's current summer offensive, says the Washington Post. It claims that Russia's military is now incapable of conducting complex operations due to several issues, including poor training, corruption, massive equipment shortages, logistical failures, and a lack of military intelligence. It also quotes an independent military analyst named Ian Matviev, who says, "These mass assault tactics are the only thing the Russian military is capable of at the moment. And it's very inhumane because in fact dead people are being traded for territory. What we have in the Russian army now is a lot of soldiers, but they have no training." Place yourself in the shoes of a Russian soldier. From the moment you enter the army, you're subjected to brutal hazing that continues once you arrive on the battlefield. Sure, your pay is good, but the 5 days of training you received is barely enough for you to figure out how to fire your rifle, never mind take part in massive human wave assaults against well-defended Ukrainian positions. Soon you accept that your only way out of the situation is to get injured or head back home in a body bag. The injury happens. Even then you're mistreated. Assuming you even get to a hospital, your medical facility doesn't have enough of what it needs to treat you properly. And to add insult to injury, the military comes calling again long before you've recovered, showing you that Putin cares about nothing more than getting more bodies onto the battlefield. How would you react to these conditions? Over 20,000 Russian soldiers have reacted by going AWOL, with thousands more deserting their posts forever. But Putin is nothing if not forgiving to his AWOL soldiers. Those who have second thoughts about being sent to a Russian prison, which is brutal in its own way, are offered an opportunity. They can commute their sentences by heading back to the front lines as part of a Storm Z unit. These military units, which were established by April 2023, are military units filled with convicts. An AWOL soldier shouldn't take this option. In October 2023, Reuters reported on the fates of many in Storm Z units, noting that one unnamed soldier who disobeyed orders by delivering medical care to the troops in one of these units said, "Storm fighters, they're just meat." He tells you a story about how his commander gave the order to refuse treatment to soldiers in one of these units, showcasing that they're considered of lesser value than Russia's ordinary troops. Even when an AWOL soldier goes to prison, they can't escape Putin's push to enter the military. If they're foolish enough to accept, they face even worse treatment than what they dealt with before they went AWOL. There are two things that Russia's massive numbers of AWOL troops tells us. Morale is terrible in Russia's army, and Putin's summer offensive is doomed to fail. On the morale front, the problem is that Russia's soldiers are fighting for a cause in which many don't believe. That's according to the National Interest, which wrote in December 2024. Unlike the Ukrainians who are fighting to defend their country from an existential threat, the Russian rank and file is fighting for something they don't associate with. And when the going gets tough, as it does because the Russian strategy is one of attrition, morale and discipline issues pop left and right. That's how you get soldiers rioting in medical facilities. It's also how you get troops going AWOL. When it comes to Putin's summer offensive, we've already touched on the issue of poor training that's leading to problems. The offensive is now stalling out. On June 29th, The Telegraph published a piece showing how bad the situation is. It notes that Russia is currently pushing in several locations, including Sumy, Kharkiv, and Donetsk. Russia has broken its own record for the number of ground assaults launched in a single month this June, the outlet says, yet none of these assaults have led to any sort of meaningful breakthroughs. In Sumy alone, Russia's forces have completely stalled. And while gains are being made elsewhere, they're for small scraps of irrelevant territory rather than any of the major targets Putin has. So many Russian troops going AWOL partially explains why this offensive is failing. The reason behind these soldiers' decisions offers more explanations: poor training, inadequate care, bullying on the front lines. It all adds up to a simple fact: Russia's military is far from the powerhouse Putin claims it to be, and it's only going to get weaker as more of Russia's soldiers abandon his cause. But it's not just his own soldiers that Vladimir Putin has to worry about. Ukraine is hitting Russia hard thanks to the brilliance of its Secret Service, or SBU. Nothing in Russia is safe anymore as Ukraine has just pulled off something unbelievable. Find out what in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more video commentaries on the problems Russia's army faces in its war against Ukraine. And thank you for watching.